I'm Abby Palco. I'm the director of the Maxine Platzerlin Women's Center here at the University of Virginia. We are sitting on Monacan land here at UVA. I'd like to ask you all to pause with me for a moment of silence in honor and recognition of those for whom 2020 has been a particularly difficult year, especially those who have been impacted by coronavirus, racialized violence, and the extreme weather events we've seen recently. Thank you. We are thrilled that you have joined us this afternoon for a conversation between Nancy Howell Agee and Marion Weiss. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the students among the audience. And I have a couple of housekeeping logistics to share as we begin. Just a reminder, if you have a question to ask, please post it in the Q&A section. We'll be taking questions from the audience near the end of this afternoon's event. And if you are a middle school or high school student and you would like to have your question bumped up near the top, please indicate that for me, that you're in middle school or high school. At this point, it is my pleasure to introduce President Jim Ryan, who has a few words of welcome for us.
Before we hear from our two 2020 UVA Distinguished Alumni directly, I'd like to take a minute to thank all of you in the university community who've joined us today to help celebrate Nancy and Marion. Both of these women truly represent the best of us. Nancy and Marion have both spoken about formative experiences they had at UVA. Hearing about the role that UVA played in their young lives, we're reminded of our responsibility to provide those experiences for our current students and for future generations. Nancy's leadership in healthcare and Marion's in design serve as a terrific example of inspiration for our faculty and students, not only in nursing and architecture, but in every discipline across the university. As a driving force behind bold partnerships across the Roanoke area, Nancy is addressing the healthcare needs and the economic and educational opportunities available across the region. Marion shapes the public sphere through her leadership on the faculty at Penn, along with the innovative and educational spaces her firm designs. Whether she's in the classroom or in her own studio, her work integrates built and natural elements to bring people together and to share the stories that need to be told for us to better understand our history and our communities. Our students and alumni at every stage of their careers see through Nancy and Marion's examples what responsible citizen leaders look like. All of UVA's distinguished alumni are committed to enriching and improving lives, and we are committed to celebrating them and thanking them for being part of the UVA tradition of service to the greater good. And so to Nancy and Marion, a heartfelt congratulations for this wonderful honor, and thanks for all you do.
I do know that President Ryan wanted to extend his congratulations to Nancy and to Marion, and so I thank him for those words. 2020 is a special year for women's education here at UVA. And that is not meant sarcastically, as 2020 and special often are taken these days. When I first arrived at the University of Virginia 4 years ago, numerous people told me there were no women students here before 1970, when UVA went co-ed. It is true that we are commemorating the 50th anniversary of the arrival of the first fully co-ed class this year, a group of women determined to make their place at UVA and to whom we owe a debt of gratitude. But it's equally true that there were women students at UVA before 1970, 30,000 of whom earned diplomas, certificates, or degrees at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels in the first 70 years of the 20th century. As we celebrate the many women who demanded access to a UVA education, some of whom were granted the opportunity, others who were denied, but whose very demand helped open the door for later women. This year, we are excited to honor women from two disciplines that represent very different paths on this single journey. Nursing was one of the first paths open to women, starting with the hospital training program that began nearly 120 years ago in 1901. While architecture awarded its first woman graduate her degree in 1935, only a handful of women followed her lead before 1970. Both of our awardees pursued their UVA degrees in the mid-70s, a moment of change and newly expansive opportunities. And they have applied that expansive vision to their careers. I would like to pause here to thank all those whose contributions have helped make this event. The deans of each school who submitted nominations, the committee members who read and discussed the nomination packets so thoughtfully, members of the Cornerstone Program project team who provided invaluable support to the Women's Center in bringing this afternoon's presentation to you, and the schools of architecture and nursing, the Office of the Provost and Vice Provost for the Arts and UVA Arts, and the Alumni Association. There's a whole community behind the two of you. As you will hear when they start speaking, while our awardees have chosen very different disciplines, they both bring a deep, abiding concern for community and the ways that their professional contributions can enhance and strengthen community connections. When the committee met in January to make this year's selection, it was immediately obvious that these were the two people we wanted to honor. And also, little did they know just how important this element of community would prove to be now when we're awarding the honor. In our years of honoring the accomplishments of the alumnae who have been selected as Distinguished Alumna Award winners, we have come to deeply appreciate the ways that each honoree's achievements speak to her particular moment. The Women's Center is proud to steward this award tradition because we see in our daily work with students the impact of trailblazing role models on their own dreams and aspirations. This year is no different. When we survey the careers that Nancy Howell Agee and Marion Weiss have had, we see the embodiment of a servant leadership ethos that echoes our own working values. We are grateful for their many contributions, and we are delighted to have the opportunity to recognize them today. We are also excited that Jieru Shi, a 2020 alumna of the McIntire School of Commerce, has joined us to moderate the conversation between Nancy and Marion. Jieru graduated with a BS in Commerce with a concentration in Management and a double major in Foreign Affairs and a minor in French. I know that she spent time outside of the classroom because among her many activities during her time at UVA was serving as an intern here at the Women's Center for 3 years. She's now a consultant with Deloitte, and today we are thrilled to welcome her back to a virtual grounds. I will turn it over to Jieru now, who will introduce our honorees.
Thank you so much, Abby. I am truly honored to be here today to have an insightful conversation with Nancy and Marion about their journeys working and shaping their careers in prominent fields. I will briefly introduce our two honorees and then begin our Q&A session so that they can share their incredible experiences with us. Also, please feel free to remember to send us your questions during the session through the chat box. Nancy graduated from the School of Nursing in 1979. As president and CEO of Carilion Clinic, Nancy leads a nearly $2 billion not-for-profit integrated health system that serves more than 1 million people in Virginia and West Virginia. Marion graduated from the School of Architecture in 1979 and became co-founder and partner at West MANFREDI. Her firm's noted projects include Olympic Sculpture Park, recognized by Time magazine as one of the top 10 architectural marvels. Thank you again to Nancy and Marion for joining us today. My first question for both of you is, what advice did you receive that helped you launch your career? Nancy, I'd love to start with you. What advice did you receive?
Thank you, Jieru. You should be doing this in French so that we would really get an education. Well, first of all, I'd like to just thank the Women's Center and all my colleagues at the University of Virginia for this award. I have to admit, when I received the phone call, I was just dumbfounded. And this is just a precious award. It means quite a lot to me. I'm guessing to Marion as well. And so thank you all very much. And thanks for all the things that you do on behalf of women and women leaders. What advice did I get? Probably not much. Quick story. I actually wanted to be a nurse from the time I was about 5 years old. for Christmas, I got a little nurse's outfit and a dog, a puppy, and that's become a lifelong passion, both having a pet and being a nurse. I would say that was amplified a bit later. As a teenager, I had a very serious illness and ended up having 5 surgeries on my leg and was in a wheelchair for the better part of a year. And the caregivers who took such amazing care of me meant so much, and I wanted to be a nurse like them. So those were the 2 things that really launched my career.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Marion, what advice did you receive that maybe helped launch your career?
Well, I think like Nancy, it came in many forms, but I think that probably the thing that does need to be said once again is that to be able to be here to have this conversation with all of you, and in a sense to be honored in this kind of forum that's recognizing leadership, that's recognizing women at University of Virginia, and that's also recognizing the very foundation that we've all benefited from here at the university. I would say that the real leadership sort of clue for me to move into architecture was coming from multiple passions. I was going to be I wanted to be a famous concert pianist, I wanted to be a famous actress, I wanted to be a famous producer, I wanted to be a famous playwright, I wanted to be a famous architect. It's unclear why, as a 12-year-old, the word famous was listed in there. But it was in every case, the thought that there was a creative field that had a possibility for expression that could affect the public engagement. The interesting thing was that I also had an uncle who was an architect, and he, in a sense, was able to draw together everything in this kind of career that seemed to touch on every aspect of, engagement, entertainment, storytelling, form giving. These broader narratives, in a sense, could be captured in architecture. So it was that sense that it had the greatest depth in terms of its opportunity to have an impact. And so the word fame kind of dropped away, and the kind of purpose, I think, sort of replaced that. And that's where I would argue that Ernest Kump, who was an architect who did a beautiful project at Foothill College, bringing architecture and landscape together, when I applied to architecture school, said there was only one school on the list that was worth going to. And of course, I'm from California. It was all West Coast schools. I had running scholarships. And I told him when he said UVA was the only good school on my list, I said, well, I've got cross-country scholarships, that I could accept at University of Oregon and Berkeley. And he said, what's more important, your college career as a runner or your life as an architect? And, it was a little patronizing, in fact, but it's why I went to UVA. And I would say that was incredible advice, and I'm incredibly grateful I got it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. On a similar note, our next question is, how did you know choosing UVA was a good decision for your education or your career development? Was there maybe just a moment where you realized that, choosing UVA was really the right choice?
I answered that question. I think Nancy needs to follow.
Yeah, Nancy, how did you know that choosing UVA was a good decision?
So, I'm a lifelong Virginian. So first of all, I knew UVA growing up. And as a child, we went to Charlottesville, and I just remember that moment of walking across the grounds, even as a middle schooler, thinking how beautiful it was, loving the history of it, the gravity of it, and thinking, this is where I need to be. Now, of course, later I went to other schools and, bigger schools, smaller schools, looked at lots of different places, and none of them felt like home. None of them felt like this is the place that I want to be. And of course, as you mentioned, as Abby mentioned, the nursing school had graduates for a while, though not at the degree level. So it had a history, and it was already recognized as one of the best schools for nursing in the country. And when you began to look at where did you want to go to school, all that history, the beautiful grounds, and going to a place that I knew was one of the best schools in the country made all the difference. The other thing I'd say, and perhaps there wasn't a moment, but there was a building moment that when I was at school, my professors really cared about me, I felt, as a person. And we had about 200 people in our class, I think, at the time. And yet each one of us felt we were personally being interested. There was great respect. And I felt like our professors pushed us to think. So it wasn't about rote, it wasn't about memorization. It was really how to think and think deeply. And about 3 or 4 months into school, I remember thinking, wow, this is really where I want to be. And the rest is history, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something I can relate to, right? Beautiful grounds, even just as a recent graduate, it's something that I miss already. And that what you talked about is actually leading up to our third question as well. During your time at UVA, was there something that made you feel like you were really part of the UVA community? Was there a memory that from your time on grounds, whose lesson that you still hold with you? So Marion, we could start with you this time.
What was most striking, and again, just to put things in context, I arrived as an incredibly homesick girl from California, cried for 6 weeks solid, and begged my parents to let me live at home and go to the junior college nearby. My arrival was heartbreaking, and yet the place that I gathered solace was actually going to the lawn and realizing that there was something incredibly special about the way the site had been shaped to leverage that which was further away and that which was close up, and that the architecture and the landscape together added up to more than just buildings and grounds. And so it seemed striking to me that the very identity that was so hallowed, that was shaped by Jefferson, could still be so restorative when I felt like a broken soul when I arrived. And so that was what came back, is going back home for Thanksgiving and then re-arriving again. It felt for a moment that it was no longer just a place for solace, but a place to belong to. There was kind of a shoulders back moment after Thanksgiving where it felt like home and it felt like the place to be, and it felt like it had a sense of being part of something far larger and yet very intimately tied to the place it resided in Charlottesville. And that, in many ways, is what's so extraordinary about the vision that Jefferson had to create this university. And that's what's so remarkable about the enduring thread that we all feel we have to it, which is that it's both enduring and yet it's intimate for each one of us.
Yeah, definitely. Nancy, was there anything you wanted to add to that question?
I could listen to Marion talk all day because she's really reflecting exactly how I feel about the university. When you first asked the question, my mind went almost immediately to the corner and the fun times at the corner. And I don't think that I've had a cream cheese and olive sandwich since, but there was a great place for a cream cheese and olive sandwich that was pretty inexpensive at the time. That was important. Going to Mincer's, going to Eljo's, just that whole corner experience. But what I also remember was having picnics almost spontaneously and often on the lawn or out in front of Behringer. And it didn't matter if you were alone or with a couple of friends. Pretty soon you had a whole group together and you were just laughing, and it was so nourishing. And you asked the question, what do you take home? And I think it's those moments of celebration, somewhat unexpected, where you create this sense of community and have some fun together, even in the midst of hard times. So as you know, I was a nursing student, and in our clinical rotations, UVA is known for extraordinary care in very difficult cases. And sometimes the work we did was hard. It was physically hard, it was emotionally, spiritually, mentally hard. And yet to walk out and have these nourishing moments on the lawn and being reflective of the history, of the sense of community, of other people caring about you, you weren't alone, meant all the world. And I've tried to take that and apply it to my career as I've gone forward.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. There are just so many spots on grounds that, really show that you're united as one. And I was lucky enough to be there when we won the basketball championship, and
Ah,
I would feel, right, the energy of just being all together. So now
well, listen, we
transitioning.
want to talk about basketball experiences. We were there when Ralph Sampson.
Exactly. They painted the roof of the rotunda, right? That was quite the homage. Yes.
Always really exciting. Yeah. So moving a little bit from questions about UVA to the incredible careers that you've built. When you look back over your career so far, what evolutions have you seen in your discipline and the way it's been practiced? Marion, we could start with you.
Well, you know, it's interesting that the evolution of the discipline of architecture in many ways has caught up with what University of Virginia's School of Architecture, next door to landscape architecture in the same building, had already figured out in the 70s. University of Virginia's architecture school was, the way the studios were laid out, is like a loft. And so undergraduate architecture students, which I was one of, we were right next door to the graduate landscape students. They were sophisticated and they were doing the coolest, large scale, broadest urban thinking, landscape thinking, larger systemic thinking. And we as architects were being asked to kind of polish the top of the architectural pyramid. But in between, there were all these conversations about these worlds being more related than unrelated. And so what's happened in the field, and why I'm so excited about our practice, which is called Weiss MANFREDI Architecture, Landscape, Urbanism, is that it's our hunch that it's the intersections between all these fields that need to be considered, because I think certainly, as we know right now, the physical and natural and social worlds are getting eroded very, very quickly. And there's no perfect site for the perfect solution. Everything's, in a sense, embedded within things that already exist and that are already powerful. So the big changes now is, I think, that the field is recognizing that we can't silo ourselves, even though the disciplinary boundaries, not to mention licensing, and I'm sure Nancy could speak about that, would suggest that you want to stay within your lane, and yet our hunch is that the most important work resides outside of the lanes. So a change that's happening, and certainly I feel fortunate as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania now, teaching graduate research studios. I'm leading cross-disciplinary graduate research studios because, in a sense, we do need to ask questions that fall well outside the core disciplinary guidelines, and we need to reframe questions. So that the biggest change now, I think, in the field is that we are finally catching up with what the world is doing, and yet our gifts as designers, which is to synthesize incredibly disparate things to find things that could be very lean and impactful, is our job. It's potentially our gift, but it begins certainly with listening a little bit harder to the questions that people have forgotten to ask. And so the big change in the field is, I think that's, in a sense, the momentum that is picking up and the strength of where the field can go forward is really about tying all these pieces together.
Yeah, that's definitely really optimistic to hear.
yeah.
Nancy, what about you? What evolutions have you seen in your field?
Well, as you can imagine, there's been just enormous change in the last 4 decades in healthcare. I'll talk specifically about oncology for a moment, as that's where, as a nurse, that's where I spent most of my time, is in oncology. When I first started doing that, we had maybe 5 chemotherapy agents. And there was not a good prognosis for most patients with cancer. And there weren't good treatment options. Fast forward till today, and there are dozens upon dozens of chemotherapeutic agents, of chemotherapeutic cocktails, immunotherapy, radiation therapy, stereotactic surgery. There's just an enormous wealth of treatment options, diagnostic options, treatment options, and we've seen a 26% decrease in mortality just in the last 10 years. Many illnesses that were fatal when I started this 4 decades ago, particularly the so-called liquid cancers like leukemia and lymphoma, are now, many are now virtually 90% plus curable. So it's just been a remarkable change. When we think about lengths of stay in the hospital, and this is interesting because we did a lot of our training both in the hospital and in the ambulatory setting and in public health. I think UVA was well ahead of its state because it really emphasized care across the continuum, not just care in the hospital, despite the fact that regulators want you to get all your training in a hospital. The lengths of stay now is very short, 2-3 days, 4 days at the most. A patient, when I started out with cataract surgery, that was done in the hospital, and the patient had to be in the hospital for 2 weeks and had to be what you call log rolled, and had to get drops in their eyes about every hour. It was a very intensive thing, and we were quite worried about the patient would go blind if we didn't do everything right and so on. Well, of course, now that's a 15-minute procedure in an outpatient facility. So enormous changes in healthcare, largely for the better. Moving to, I guess, my second career, and that's as the CEO of a health system, moving into a leadership position. It's similar in that we've seen so much change that's not just hospital-centric, but is across the continuum of care. The real focus now is so-called hospital at home, where we can do a whole lot of care for our patients in their home or in other, being agnostic actually to the care location, using technology, using apps, using wearables. And UVA is truly on the forefront of all of those new technologies, new therapies, new diagnostic tools. It's quite an exciting time in healthcare. I would encourage any of the young people that are listening to consider careers in healthcare.
Yeah, definitely. And our last question is something that you may have touched on a little bit, but I would love if you could elaborate. What do you think is a current challenge that you see your profession called on to address? Marion, we can start with you.
Well, I think Abby began with the challenges that we have in our time right now. In 2020, I think, has certainly illuminated the challenges that we have. In the fact that the challenges of the world are in fact more interconnected than ever. Obviously, the pandemic's brought into focus how interdependent we are. I would say this kind of social issues that have been brought to the fore identify the fact that we are, in a sense, vulnerable as communities, and we need to somehow be mindful of what we can do to contribute to those connections. And I would say that the virtual, and here we are having a virtual conversation, the virtual world is both a gift and it's a challenge in terms of the simplicity by which we can shut each other out, but only open ourselves to each other through these virtual worlds. And so when I think about the challenges that are lying ahead to our profession in architecture, one of the biggest questions is, can we be at the table sooner? And architects are often brought to the table when the question has been framed, the budget has been set, the site has been selected, and the goal has been established. And yet as synthetic thinkers and maybe people who can unpack questions, I would argue that one of the biggest challenges is how to get to the table sooner so that in fact the kind of efficacy and the focus of what we are engaged to do can be shaped alongside those who are leaders. So, for instance, right now, my firm is working on the US Embassy in New Delhi, India. There was a very clear mandate for the project. Security, of course, is, in parallel to design excellence. I argue it's even more important. And yet the question is, well, what is design excellence in that context? Well, it's about embodying the values of diplomacy. And diplomacy actually doesn't just mean the conversation, but it also means recognizing our role when we're in another country. And so here we are in a place where Edward Durrell Stone did this almost tropical modernism in the 60s. It embodied what diplomacy should be, but it had a big circular reflecting pool. It was a gorgeous fountain, and all it did was evaporate water in all its symbolism. Today, we need to return then and actually make it now a place that gathers water during the monsoon season and then releases it to serve the community within the embassy during the dry season. So it has a performative opportunity rather than just a symbolic one. So we're getting an opportunity to ask 50 years after the embassy had been built, as we do 12 new buildings and rejuvenate 27 acres. We're asking these questions now of environmental stewardship and diplomatic stewardship and saying, how can they be seen together? And it's this question of how many things can be done with how very few resources we have so beautifully that, like the lawn at UVA, it elevates our sense as a community and, in a sense, does what design can and should do, which is open itself up to people who wouldn't necessarily afford design, expect it, or know that, in fact, it's there to, in a sense, move us forward. So when I think about all the challenges, they've never been greater and our resources have never been fewer. Our social and natural realms are being eroded increasingly. And so, in effect, I think we do need to be at the table with the larger questions, even if when we arrive at the table, it can look a little late, ask them, and maybe use design as a way to lead and recast those questions to allow people maybe to see things that had never been seen before.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those are definitely things to keep in mind. Nancy, what about you? What are some significant challenges that you see your profession called on to address?
Well, clearly the COVID pandemic has taken our breath away. It's been a phenomenon that none of us could have predicted just 7 months ago. And people were called on to do things in a hurry with changing recommendations nearly daily, and yet care for very sick people. At the same time worried, were they going to be themselves sick or were they carrying something to their families and friends? It's been a very tough time, a tiring time, and yet I feel like I'm walking amidst heroes for real. The just the simple changes that our nursing staff have had to tackle, like wearing goggles and face masks and gowns and gloves, when we're used to touching a patient, when we're used to hand holding, when we're used to really communicating in a different way. And this goes on day in and day out. I think people forget about how awkward that is to care for a patient in that garb, how awkward and hot it gets, and there's no escape. It's wearying, it's exhausting. And so we're learning a new normal all over again. What's really remarkable is the spirit of ingenuity, of making things better, and of looking at each other through our eyes and recognizing, the eyes are the soul, really, and communicating a different way. What's been wonderful is that patient care has not only not suffered, I think it's better than ever, and patients and their experience has been very positive. Even when we've had to shut down visitation, when our whole milieu is a different environment than we learned, that's good. So it's been an incredible time. What's really important, sorry, my computer's gonna go down if I don't move it, is to understand, I think, that our ecosystem has changed forever. And we need to learn how to make the new tools that we're using work for us to improve health. And so, yeah, the challenges are enormous. I think from a nursing perspective, we've always cared for all comers, regardless of their skin color, their sexual orientation, of their gender, of their racial heritage. And I think we've led the way. It's nice to know that nurses, for instance, in poll after poll, are the most trusted professional. And I think that's because we care for everyone, agnostic to all the rest. But I want to touch a minute on being intentional about promoting women leaders. So it's still true that in Fortune 500 companies, in healthcare organizations, there are very few women in the C-suite. And the number's pretty much unchanged in the last 10 to 15 years. I think that we, as women leaders, must be much more intentional about promoting women, and that we don't want another 50 years to go by where that same is true. And so one thing that I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about and doing is not just the value of healthcare or the economics of healthcare or the care in healthcare, but how to promote women in healthcare.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think those are really interesting things to keep in mind, especially as you said, with our new environment. So now we're going to move on to a few questions from the audience. And so our first question is, what do you feel was the greatest challenge that you faced as a woman when you were a student? And with that, today, what do you consider the greatest challenge is for women in general? And this is specifically, more specifically for women in the West, noting that our sisters in developing nations still face very extreme challenges as well. We can start with Nancy this time.
Well, you know, I'm glad I touched on some of that a minute ago. I was very fortunate at UVA to be in a sisterhood, so to speak. So almost all of my colleagues were women in nursing school. And so we had a sense of community, and it wasn't much of an issue. I think fast forward, as I mentioned, and as I grew in leadership positions, and you know, I'm one of only a handful of CEOs of health systems even today. And I think the greatest challenge for us is that, at least here in the West, is that we're not recognized, particularly in STEM and in science, technology, education, engineering, and math. We're not recognized for the value that we bring. And it's, I guess it's a little bit like Ginger Rogers, you know, dancing barefoot and dancing backwards in high heels. It's a little harder for us to make our way into key leadership positions.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Marion, what do you think has been some challenges?
Well, I think that the first challenge that anybody faces, man or woman, when we find ourselves in an environment that's taking us into new realms of competitiveness and capacity expectations, which you could say architecture and nursing, all of a sudden, as a student, you're being asked to do more than you've ever been asked to do with something that you know nothing about. And the pace of needing to learn, the pacing of needing to become an expert is quite tremendous. And in the case of architecture, I would say perhaps the biggest difficulty is that the critique, the studio environment and the studio review, where your work is being critiqued in front of everybody with a jury of critics. And in fact, you have design critics. The term critic is important. They're there to critique and criticize the work. But as a 17-year-old student just beginning at UVA, I felt, of course, like they were critiquing me. And I took it very personally, and you could say, well, is that a feminine trait? I'm not sure. I do remember being told that my work was unacceptable in front of 45 other colleagues. And I then took that opportunity to march straight over to the English department, because I knew that was another strength, and asked to switch from architecture to English, because I knew that I might not be criticized so publicly as I was in that forum. Bob Kellogg, who was then dean then and also became dean of the college at UVA, was very gracious with me. And he said, you exempted from so many of our credits that you could actually enroll in our English department as a sophomore. So why don't you give it a year in architecture? Come back if you really want to be an English major, but see if maybe there's some aspect of architecture that you can engage. It was a very, very smart thing that he said. I'm forever grateful to Bob Kellogg. And it did mean, though, that the hardest thing was to actually develop a thicker skin, to know that these public attacks were going to be part of my education for 4 years. And yet that exposure and the need to know what you needed to do next to make something better and stronger, and be able to communicate your ideas through more and more rigorous drawings and more rigorous models, and most importantly, more and more rigorous thought. It was that public experience of education that said concepts and form and expression need to all be at an extraordinary level for you to be able to advance to the next level. So it was the hardest thing. It was the most difficult thing. And you could argue as a woman, I was maybe tearier than others might have been, but maybe it was also being 17. But there was that sense that there was a thicker skin that had to be acquired to be able to push a little further. If we fast forward then to my practice, my partner Michael Manfredi and I were fortunate to find that we shared the common sense that people who can't afford architecture should be able to get it. We did a bunch of pro bono projects and early collaborations before we formed our practice. We entered the competition for the Women's Memorial, and we were fortunate to win it at Arlington Cemetery. And then we entered another competition to do Olympia Fields Park. And that was another competition we won right afterwards. In fact, it got built sooner than the. But in the meetings, when I was working closely with the civil engineer and then translating things back to the owner and the contractor, I would outline all the water detention and retention requirements, the volumetric setbacks, and the release into the storm sewer system. And the answers would be directed back to Michael. So it was a three-way conversation where no matter how much I had the expertise and the answer, the conversation was still directed back at my partner. Now that's never happened again, and yet it was an exceptional moment to realize that there are people who might be predisposed, even if you carry the insight, to not want to hear that message from you or value it. And so in a sense then, the benefit of having a partner like Michael, feminist whose mother, I might add, was a nurse. And so she was in World War II. She was an incredible leader, a nurse in the Army. He knew that the whole job that he had that moment was to redirect the question and the dialogue back to me. And so being able to have a partner who recognizes that, in a sense, if oversights are occurring, that small corrections are important corrections to make. So finding the right partner, I would say, is also a kind of very fortunate thing in the midst of finding people who value what you do have to say and do, and make sure that you kind of build that world around you, which is giving everybody that opportunity to have their voice valued.
Marion, you reminded me of a fascinating story, and that sort of thing unfortunately still happens, but not long after I became the CEO, I was introduced to someone at a cocktail party. And he said, you're the CEO? Yes. But you're a, and I laughed and said, you're right, I'm smart. And he laughed, and I said, that's not what you meant. And he said, well, I've never met a woman who could be the CEO. And he was about 75. He was a little older. But I'm glad I answered with a sense of humor, because you could be somewhat offended. That doesn't help anybody, just let's move on.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories. So we are running a little bit out of time, so this will be our last question. So a couple of audience members have asked, if you have children, how have you successfully balanced work life over your career? Of course, this is an age-old common question, but also very important during this pandemic. Marion, we can start with you this time.
Well, I've been fortunate to have an extraordinary stepdaughter, but I had no biological children. So the real question, which I think is so illuminated right now with the pandemic, is if indeed you have the passion to have a career and you have the gift of having children, the simultaneity of those will be forever a balancing act. And certainly staff in our office right now who have kids at home and are still on the line, it's a crazy combination. But I don't feel I'm in a position to be able to speak with any authority about what that might mean, because my role, I think, was a supportive role rather than, in a sense, a day-to-day role.
So my biggest cheerleader and best friend is my husband. And he's enormously supportive, thank goodness. And we have one child. I have a son who's fabulous, who's 32 now, and I have a grandchild. So it's a wonderful time in our lives. I would say that work-life balance is, nobody ever gets it right, and I don't care what you say. It's always a challenge. I remember talking to the president of a university who is a woman, and she said, I can be the president of the university all day long, but when it's 7 o'clock, I'm the one cooking dinner. And, you know, I kind of get that. But Zach was always incredibly proud of me. I tried really hard to do the things that were important to him, like get to his soccer meetings, to watch his soccer games, to be there. At one point, he was about 10 years old, and he said to me, Mom, it's embarrassing. You're always there in a suit. All the other mothers are in shorts. Now, that wasn't quite true, but he noticed the difference. But about that same time, I actually didn't get laid off, but they reorganized. I was a vice president. They reorganized and took out 20% of the senior management team, including my position, was eliminated. And I thought a lot about what to do. And I was talking to my husband and my son and saying, I think that I am going to work. I'm going to quit my job. I'm not going to look for a position there. And what do you think? And Zach quickly said, Mom, you work. It's what you do. It's what we need you to do to be happy. And it was great advice from my son. So, you know, but I think that whole work-life balance thing is really tough. It's a decision you make every day. I would say that the most important people in my life are those who I love, including my work family. But you've got to be sure that your family is going to be there for the long term, and set them up as a priority.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. So that's all the time we have for our Q&A session. Thank you again so much to both of you for sharing your stories and experiences with us. Now I'll give it back to Abby for our presentation of awards.
So in a minute, I will present the award first to Marion and then to Nancy. I was struck as you were talking that Nancy said, but I think either one of you could have said this, that our ecosystem has changed forever. And now we need to learn how to use new tools. And as I was listening to your reflections and your answers, that's one of the pieces that I will carry away with me. Marion, your point that we need to listen to questions people forgot to ask. And Nancy, yours that healthcare now is being forced to look into patients' eyes, look into each other's eyes in new ways and find new ways of communication. I said earlier that it always seems to me like the Distinguished Alumna honorees speak to their moment in really poignant ways. So thank you for proving that point correct. So the Distinguished Alumna Award was established in 1991 to honor alumnae whose contributions at the highest level of their fields reflect the spirit of excellence and the ethic of service for which a University of Virginia education stands. In 2020, as we celebrate the courage, persistence, and determination that women demonstrated for more than a century in pursuit of an UVA education, we are grateful for the opportunity to honor you, Marion Weiss, Architecture of 1979, for the myriad ways you have reflected a spirit of excellence and an ethic of service in your distinguished career, notably in your commitment to ensuring a landscape that is welcoming to all. It is my pleasure to present you with the 2020 Distinguished Alumna Award, and congratulations. If you'd like to say a couple of words.
Thank you so much. And I just have to say it's incredibly humbling to both be receiving award and be recognized along with Nancy. And also humbling to know the work that you all are doing with the Women's Center and what the university continues to do to elevate the notion of service that we can all bring to the world with the gift of our education, in a sense, behind us. I think in thinking about the inspirations that all of us have drawn from, I think it's worth noting that all of us have been able to stand on the shoulders of people who've come before us. And I feel like as an architect and an educator, I've been fortunate to be able to stand on the shoulders of the professors and the colleagues that I had at the university, and also that I've had since then. And in many ways, what's clear is that the work we have to do is urgent. It's not easy work. And it seems like there's nothing worthwhile to do that is in fact easy. But I think we have to kind of dive in head first to say, what contributions can we make? How do we need to collaborate with folks who we might not have collaborated before? Because there's a work that's there to be done, and there's opportunities that we have to enter those conversations. I'm personally passionate about the social and public and natural realms being brought together. And I think just it's really worth noting that the university has always brought those together. This was never an afterthought. This has always been at the center. So thank you so much. I'm deeply honored. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, the Women's Center. Thank you, Nancy, for also illuminating your world to us. Huge honor and big thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Okay. I'm going to read the citation for you again, Nancy, because this one would be specific to you. So, the Distinguished Alumna Award was established in 1991 to honor alumnae whose contributions at the highest level in their fields reflect the spirit of excellence and the ethic of service for which a University of Virginia education stands. In 2020, as we celebrate the courage, persistence, and determination that women demonstrated for more than a century in pursuit of a UVA education, we are grateful for the opportunity to honor you, Nancy Howell Agee, with Nursing 1979, for the myriad ways you have reflected a spirit of excellence and an ethic of service in your distinguished career, notably in your commitment to ensuring access to quality health care for all. I present you with the 2020 Distinguished Alumna Award with my congratulations.
Thank you, Abby. Marion said it well. This is just a huge honor, and I am so deeply touched and very much appreciative. You know, there are three things that mean so much to me, and there are two values, one of which you just said, and that's courage, and the other is curiosity. Two values that I think UVA instilled in me: courage to do the right thing, courage to be a servant leader, and the curiosity to always, always look for the next thing, to look deeper and harder. And I guess I want to close by just paraphrasing Maya Angelou's comment that people will forget what was said to them, people will forget what you do, but they won't forget how they made you feel. And I won't ever forget how you have made me feel today, and my great memories from the University of Virginia. So thank you so much for this great award. Thanks for all that you're doing to forward women and women leaders. And please stay in touch.
Thank you. As the two of you were talking, I was reflecting on the fact that I had the joy and privilege of calling you to tell you you'd been selected as the 2020 honorees back in February in a really different world. So as Nancy said earlier, our ecosystem has changed. It is lovely to bring that moment around to conclusion here with the chance to honor you this way. I'm sorry that it isn't looking the way we envisioned it would in February, but I am very grateful that you spent time with us this afternoon, sharing your thoughts and your reflections. There have been comments in the chat with people passing on their congratulations and their thanks as well. One in particular says, this is such an uplifting and centering conversation. Thank you for sharing your journey and perspectives as they resonate so well.
Thank you.
So on that note, I will thank our audience for joining us, in particular Dean Cipriano and Dean Berman from the nursing school and the architecture school, the rest of our audience for being with us and helping us to celebrate the two of you this afternoon. My thanks and congratulations to you all, and my best wishes for a lovely evening. Thank you.
Very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much.